Senator Cullimore come up and he gave us his rundown, and then we had Ledge Council come in, walk through it Tuesday, I think. But we thought we should have you come in also and go over what it looks like right now. And if you want to allude to what it might have looked like in an earlier version, we've already gotten a little bit of that background.
Yeah.
If folks want to pull up the version as passed by is it on our page today, Laura? Or yesterday?
Not, but it would be yesterday.
Yeah, okay, or the day before.
If anyone wants a paper copy, I have some, just, yeah.
Thank you, yeah.
Yeah, you can pass them around if you want.
Thank you.
Sure, yeah. Try not to waste too much paper, but sometimes I just need a copy.
Sometimes it's easier on paper.
Yeah, for reading.
Yeah.
These old eyes. You gotta keep us pulp cutters in business. Thank you.
Okay.
All set?
Your
So
copy.
We've got one member, you may have heard, Representative Supernant is on Zoom. We'll try not to forget her if she has questions. But why don't you, so I guess you know why you're here.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell us what you think we should know.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much to all of you for having us over. Steve Collier from General Counsel from the Agency of Agriculture. My thought was I would give you kind of an overview as to the why for each section. And then if you have any questions to ask, I did listen to Mr. O'Grady's testimony, so I know you've had a good sort of overview of it already. But that's what I thought I'd do. And I think it's all, most from our perspective, all of it actually was pretty straightforward. One of the provisions has since become politically controversial, although in my opinion, it's not at all legally ambiguous. So I'll start with section 1, if that works.
Yep.
So this is a pretty simple amendment that we're requesting, and it's essentially the whole point of livestock quarantine is to protect public safety, animal health, make sure that animals that are potentially either have a contagious disease or their products may be contaminated the animals aren't being moved and the food isn't being sold. So we already have this existing authority to quarantine livestock. Right now, that's very clear about contagious diseases. So if we believe an animal may be infected with a contagious disease, it's also very clear if we think their animal tissue may be infected by a chemical or biological agent. It's not clear about other products from that animal. So dairy, milk, any other product, non-meat product from the animal. The quarantine authority is not as clear as we'd like it right now. And we sort of became aware of this because of a specific case. So the only thing we're asking to do is to give us the ability that we already have, but it's to quarantine animals that we have reason to believe they've consumed a chemical or biological agent that may make their product, any animal product from those animals, unsafe to eat. So that's what this request is about.
I was just going to ask if this was sort of born out of a real life situation. So can you just give us an example of whether the real one or,
Sure, I won't mention any names, but an animal, a dairy animal consumes some copper naphthenate, which is a pesticide, a wood preservative. And the farmer was very cooperative and worked with us, but it is very difficult to assess what that may do to the milk. There's no defined science about it, and that can happen fairly commonly where for some products, there's a clear way to test and determine what's tolerable and what's not. There's no tolerable amount in a food product for copper naphthenate. So trying to evaluate how long the residue may remain and how it may be processed and whether or not there's even a testing mechanism can take some time. So, I mean, all of this again is in the name of food safety. And if we don't want someone to be consuming milk or ice cream or butter or any product that might have a poison in it. So but sometimes it may take some time to figure that out. So that we were able to manage that situation, but it also made it clear to us that perhaps the authority ought to be plainer. So, yeah.
Representative O'Brien?
So looking into the future, what happens with, say, microplastics? You know, if animals are eating them, they're decided, down the road that we shouldn't be eating, animals that have these in them. Would those potentially be biological or chemical?
So here it is, a beautiful day, and you're trying to scare me. It's a wonderful question. We are very concerned about the implications of microplastics, PFAS, all kinds of things being put onto farmland, being either uptaken by the crops or by the animals and passed into the food system. It's an area that's very concerning. Companies keep making these products faster than they can be assessed and regulated. I guess the quick answer is anything that we know to be adulterated, so unsafe to eat, we and/or the Department of Health or FDA or USDA, we have the authority to quarantine that, stop it. How to determine that is often, with new things, is often the hard part. What's a tolerable level of microplastics? We're all eating them every day, as I understand it.
Yeah.
But what's a tolerable level? And I think what worries us is we obviously don't want anybody, the whole half of our agency is dealing with food safety every day and trying to make sure that our food supply is safe to eat. We obviously don't want any food to be unsafe to eat. We also, though, don't want disparate standards applied to different things just because people happen to be looking. As an example, as I understand it, which is not particularly well, but PFAS is pretty ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And so we obviously need to address that, but we don't want to address it one product at a time. As an example, we wouldn't want to stop a Vermont dairy farm from selling its milk when maybe the milk we're importing from Pennsylvania or New York or Maine is worse. And so that's, I think when you're trying to evaluate food safety, you sort of need to take a step back and look at it big picture so that we're using similar standards across the board instead of targeting, one farm, one area without evaluating what else is happening elsewhere. So wonderful question, more to come. I think it's a really important issue we all do. Trying to navigate the appropriate standards is going to be something I'm sure you'll all be working on at some point.
Can I just ask a follow?
Yeah.
So on something like avian.
I'm sorry, on some of.
Avian influenza, avian.
Yeah.
There must have been flocks with avian flu, eggs were sold commercially, right? So what responsibility does the agency have to almost say, this might sound bad, but we're going to take them off the market, or that you could eat them and then you won't get avian flu?
Well, I don't know honestly the answer of whether an infected bird's eggs are also infected, but what I will, but our experts do, and
Yeah.
Dr. Haas and Dr. Levine, our own Dr. Levine, there are two in the state. I'm sure they know the answer to that, but more importantly, with avian influenza, there are very strict federal and state protocols immediately. So as soon as that is discovered, that farm, at least that portion of the farm is basically shut down. And once a farm is known to have avian influenza, so you want to make sure first that the birds have to be depopulated. So it's quick, swift, and depending on the scope of the issue, that quarantine zone can be expanded sort of exponentially. So there's an example where the risks are pretty well known, although, things can change as we know with diseases and how they can adapt. But there's pretty strict protocols in place that we believe that is serious enough, and the federal government does too, that there are some strict protocols in place. And, whether or not they're always flawless is a different question, but we do have a game plan of what to do in that situation.
Steve, when we were looking at the other bill with the nursery stock, we talked about the fact that the owner of the But, sorry, out of context here maybe, but nursery shack could be confiscated if there was a disease and the owner wasn't compensated, would not be compensated.
Yep.
We're not addressing compensation here at all, but maybe there's somewhere else in statute that does say that, if you've got an animal that needs to be confiscated, you're not going to be made whole. Is that the case?
That's a great question. I can't think of right now in the state statutes mandatory compensation provisions for livestock, although it's possible, but I don't think we have any. But in the example of avian influenza, the federal government through USDA did compensate and does compensate for depopulation. So the USDA often has a lot more funding than we do, and they're also kind of primarily responsible for managing. And we have our part, but they're looking more broadly at the federal level. And so, and a lot of it is trade related concerns as well, because if we don't manage diseases here, then we have a lot more trouble exporting our products, and people are always looking for trade. Other countries are always looking for trade advantages too. So the USDA does provide compensation in the case of avian influenza. As I understand it, it's kind of a disease-specific question, and it's not automatic, but I need to get our experts to really answer that question well. Any other questions about the the livestock quarantine? So should we move to section 2, eggs? This is simple but wonky. It's an old statute, primarily drafted in 1973. And really the only thing we want to do is update it, because the laws were pretty different in 1973 than they are now. And really our principal concern was the authority that we had is almost non-existent in the current law. Really, the only thing that we're regulating in the current law is the labeling of eggs as grade A and their containers. And that's great, but arguably what's more important is that if eggs are adulterated, they're not being sold because they're unhealthy to eat. And so we really just wanted to clarify what our authority is. So we added that if you look at page 3 and you're looking at lines 2, 3, and 4, paragraphs 2, 3, and 4. So that's lines 7 through 10. We're just expanding what we can do as the agency. So if someone is falsely advertising their eggs, we can take action. If someone is violating the statute or the rules under the statute, we can take action. And if someone is selling adulterated eggs, we can take action. So that's consistent with our food safety authority in other areas, but it wasn't in the egg statute. If you go to the next section, section 3, so line 15, we're just eliminating or asking to eliminate a program in the agency that no longer exists. And then if you go to page 4, the notice of violation, this is some of the old piece of the language that doesn't exist. A lot of laws used to be criminal instead of civil, and there's been traffic tickets used to be criminals, speeding tickets used to be criminal. And so one of the things that we used to have to do or could do is, oh, sure, thanks.
Representative Rice.
Sorry, just a quick question back on page 3.
Yep.
Is there a definition in this context for false or misleading? Is there somewhere where you would point to what that is that you're prohibiting?
No, not for this language, but I think it would be, from my perspective, those terms are pretty clearly defined in a dictionary definition. So if someone had a claim that's wrong, just outright wrong, then that they can't do that.
So like in the context of like when somebody's saying backyard eggs, but they actually have a farm. Like I'm just trying to figure out sort of what might be a place where you would enforce this and.
Well, it could be Vermont eggs. They're all Vermont eggs. Well, no. If they're all from New York and you're saying that they're Vermont eggs, now in that case, we'd probably work with the Attorney General's office, because the Attorney General's office is responsible under the Consumer Protection Act to enforce the quote unquote local or Vermont label. But I mean, if someone is doing anything to misrepresent what the eggs actually are, then we could take an administrative enforcement action. Keeping in mind, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but our agency is education first. You know, we don't come in with sledgehammers. We come in with notice and with education and opportunities to correct, depending on the scope of what's happening. But I mean, to me, it's you're trying to sell something and you're misrepresenting what it is. So as long as you're accurately describing what you're doing, this doesn't come into play. If you're claiming that all your eggs come from your, you know, Henrietta the hen who lives on your property, but really they come from Pennsylvania, then yeah, it's probably false.
Okay.
A1 candle, what does candle mean?
So candling is a I've heard it described, but it's assessing an egg through a litany of little handheld tests. And it's something that Tucker Diego, who does our inspections, understands, and the federal officials who do egg inspections understand. I don't. It's some kind of, you know, you can't break the egg,
It's
obviously.
literally, it like comes from shining a light on it. Under
Or a
the
candle.
candle under the egg and looking for spot, like, you know, looking for something that.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. And I believe a part of the idea is to see if there's any break in the shell, the protective membrane, because eggs can become contaminated if the shell is broken. I think that's part of the process, but yeah.
John?
Does this cover all domestic eggs, so duck eggs, goose eggs, emu eggs? I don't know if you're even allowed to, you know.
Eggs for sale. I mean, yeah, if you are selling eggs, it doesn't, yeah.
Sorry to ask this question.
No, go ahead.
Is it specific to poultry eggs?
What kind of eggs are we thinking about?
Or fish eggs?
Like caviar?
I know that we don't regulate fish eggs as far as I know. We do regulate fish farming.
Yeah, and certainly you can farm sturgeon and harvest their eggs.
I'm pretty confident that in this 1973 statute, let me see if there's individual shell eggs are defined.
Shell eggs.
Yeah,
But that could be
Um,
reptilian too.
candling is actually defined too. I can read that to you if you'd like.
Yes, sir.
Means the process by that apparent condition of the egg is determined by holding and twirling the egg before a bright light. Any type or make of kindling light may be used that enables the grader to make consistently accurate determination of the quality of shell eggs. So that's what that means. I'm just seeing if there's anything more about, I know there's no mention of fish, and I don't think there's any way to read fish into these definitions. There is a definition of individual shell eggs. It means those eggs are the product of the domesticated chicken hen that are in the shell, but I'm not sure that all of the uses are only individual shell eggs. So I don't know that that's necessarily dispositive. But yes, poultry eggs are what we're inspecting and looking at.
Are all eggs that are sold in Vermont anyway grade A? Is that federal?
I believe they have to be grade A to be sold, or, I mean, I think that, sorry, let me look at this language. And we could certainly bring in Tucker Diego, who is our expert on eggs if you'd like, but yeah, the way I read this definition is that that's really the only thing that we regulate now, or that they have to be grade A or better. If they're labeled that way, so.
Because they're definitely
Right, right. And so if you're not labeling that way, you can't use any of those words that are listed, and you'd have to say that they're not grade A, or at least accurately identify them. Yeah.
How low do the grades go? Is there a D?
I don't know. Are you great? I've never seen a D egg.
How about a B egg?
I've seen a double A.
You've seen what? Sorry?
Double A,
Double A?
that's the high A. figure.
We better have Tucker Diego come in.
A bond rating and an egg rating. I thought they were grade A or Halloween eggs. I didn't know there was a.
Okay, so
And there's Easter eggs.
Easter eggs, right?
There's chocolate Cadbury eggs.
Henry.
Let's try not to draw this out. This is a serious question.
Okay.
I'm thinking of, there's lots of small operators that reuse cartons. So putting eggs in cartons that say grade A, that's a very common, but they're not graded in any way. Where does that fall in the,
False advertising.
yeah, like what, cause I mean, that's just a common, that's everybody.
Yeah,
I do that. I mean,
Yeah.
like,
Well, that's a great question. And actually it's not in the language that's before you because we're not asking to modify it, but there is a section on the marking of containers.
okay.
It's section 354 in the legislation. And it does say, and it does explain the ground rules for how you're doing it. So the way it reads, if I remember correctly, is you could send eggs to a processor and have them in a container that's not marked accurately because the processor would then be putting them in an accurately marked container. But if you're selling the eggs to somebody, the container does have to accurately reflect what you're selling. So,
Probably why you often see farms are using cartons and putting a sticker in the bottom.
Yeah.
right. And it would implicate potentially the false or misleading claims if you're selling eggs and it's a container that doesn't say what your eggs are. But again, as long as you're modifying that to be accurate, then that's fine.
Just one thing on grade B eggs, that's you don't usually see them because they're often used to make liquid frozen or dried egg products. So would
Really?
those eggs be included in this? You know, that sort of, I'm a baker and I go and buy yolks, you know, instead of shell eggs.
The whole construct here is for, as I understand it, is for selling eggs to a consumer, to anybody who's consuming them. So,
Is it still an egg if it's not in a shell anymore? That's, I guess.
if it's not in its shell,
Right.
I don't know how you'd sell.
Because I can go to, does anybody bake there? Who can go to probably Hannaford's and buy just yolks?
Right, or they can carton of eggs.
Right, exactly, yeah.
You guys are on fire today.
It's like every day, Steve.
Good food we eat. The eggs.
We supply, I mean, it's,
You know, I don't want to get Josie upset, but you know, I was in the bar room, there was
She's just gonna keep going. Thank you.
pickled eggs.
Oh, for God's sake.
Wait, you don't like pickled eggs?
I just wanna get through this bill.
These are all potential floor questions, so.
That's right.
I seriously doubt anyone's gonna ask me about pickled eggs at a bar. Said maybe Jed.
I'm pretty sure we don't regulate yolks sold independently of the egg in this section. Pickled eggs, if they're in an egg shell, yeah, maybe.
All right. We are already lining up Tucker Diego to come in next week to answer all the egg questions.
Get them ready, guys. Get 'em ready.
So,
It's okay. I'm never gonna listen.
so looking at page 4, eliminating the notice to the state's attorney because we're not going to ask the state's attorney to prosecute anybody for any of these violations. We are, the whole remainder of our requests are just to harmonize this with how we do things in our general enforcement practices. And it's really mostly making the due process obligations that we have to afford to those we regulate clear. So it's actually it's outlining our authority, but it's also telling people who are subject to our authority, this is what the process is so that they get the clear expectations, which we want. And the first part in 356 in section 356, so starting on line 5 on page 4. This just gives us the ability to give someone a written warning and ask them to correct it. So this is that sort of lenient sort of enforcement that I'm talking about that we often like to do as a first measure. So it gives us that ability to do that, clearly outlines it. The next piece is starting on line 16 is we're asking to eliminate this old penalty section. This is when we were supposed to refer things to the state's attorney. The penalties are completely outdated. It also has mandatory penalties, which we don't want for a first offense and for a second offense. So we're just asking to eliminate that and instead use our standard penalty structure, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes because that's later on in this provision. The next part, so on page 5, we basically just outline what our enforcement authority is and what people have a right to expect from us. So if we order you to do something, we have to give you notice. We have to give you a right to a hearing. You have a right to come to that hearing. You can contest the hearing. You can disagree with us. And if whatever we ultimately decide after the hearing, you can appeal that to the court and the court can ultimately decide. So this is just laying out those functions that we already have in our general powers. But in the egg statute, it's not clear because it's an old statute that had different standards at the time.
So when you say you already have them in your general powers, that's spelled out somewhere else in statute, not specific to eggs, but.
Correct. In chapter 1 of Title VI, there's, I think, 24 sections that outline the secretary's general authority. And included among those are when we're enforcing the penalties, the notice and due process that's required for everyone, and how we can enforce that civilly if we need to. Those are sections 15, 16, and 17 of that chapter 1. But so yeah, it applies not only to Title VI, but it applies to Title IX, where our weights and measures provisions are, and also Title 20, where we have some control over animals. So basically, we have general powers that govern unless there's a different, more specific provision. So right now, because there's a different, more specific penalty provision for eggs, we would have to use this penalty provision for eggs instead of our general authority. But we are moving towards wanting to be more consistent across all of our programs instead of saying, $50 for eggs and $200 for, something else and $5,000 for something else. Is we would like to have the same kind of authority across our programs because that, I think, makes more sense.
John?
So when there's a violation, just talk through, if I'm the chicken farmer, do you draft a letter? Is there sort of a boilerplate letter that helps with these, you've done this, it's not okay with the agency, here's what you do, or send someone to the farm that help educate the violation?
It totally depends on what the circumstance is. So, if there's a carton labeling issue, it might be an oral conversation. Tucker might be on the farm and say, hey, can you explain what you mean by Henry fresh eggs here? And it might make perfect sense, or it might not, or maybe it says these eggs are all Vermont eggs, but they've just seen a truck come in from New York with an egg delivery. And so Tucker might say, ask for clarification on that. So it might be a conversation and it's resolved right then and there. If eggs were unsafe to eat, if we believe that they were being stored in a way that was really dangerous, then there would be an oral order at the time to stop selling these. You need to stop selling these eggs until we can further assess. And that oral order would then be followed up by a written order and identifying exactly what needed to be stopped. And it would also be followed up by additional site visits to evaluate whatever the situation was. So from there, there could, what we could ask for could be corrective actions, meaning fix this. Could be penalties, depending on what we think and how bad it is and whether or not if we suddenly have reason to believe this person has been knowingly selling contaminated eggs and we found out 4 people are sick from it, that might be something where we're issuing a notice of violation, saying this is very serious. We think that you caused these 4 people to become sick and we think you knew about it. So that's where our penalty provisions would come in. But I think importantly, we have a range of options for how we enforce. But I think no matter what we do, the person we're regulating can either agree with us or disagree. If they agree, then it's pretty easy to come to a solution and a conclusion. If they disagree, they can contest it. And our orders are enforceable I mean, what we say, if we stop sale, they can't just ignore that without potential further penalty, but they could go to a court and get it overturned. So, you know, we do have a lot of authority, but ultimately, everything that we do is subject to court. Everything we do that requires someone to act is subject to review by the court.
Just to be clear here, Steve, the new language is being added in this section. Is it just reinforcing what's already in the general powers that you already have?
Yes, it references like, for example, on line 9 on page 5, it says that we can seek administrative or civil penalties in accordance with the requirements of sections 15, 16, or 17. Those are those general powers that I was talking about. It also aligns the egg statute more consistently to all of our other enforcement programs. You know, so there was a big update to water quality a number of years ago, 2015, 2016, because of the attention that was getting. And so the litany of due process requirements and expectations were kind of laid out there. And I think over time we're conforming a lot of our other programs to those standards because it just makes more sense to be clear across the board. But there are the general powers in chapter 1 that have always been there as well. So yes, it's absolutely, in our opinion, consistent with what we do and would do even without this language. But this makes it clear. It's always better to say what you can and can't do. And it puts the expectations on us. You know, our people, we get turnover, we get new people in, they're enforcing the rules. It's helpful for them to be able to go to the statute and say, this is what I can do, and this is what I have to do if I'm going to do it. So it's good to have that clarity across the board, I think. Are there any other questions about eggs that I can't answer?
No.
Is it a boy or a girl?
So should we move to administrative penalties?
Sure.
Section 6?
Section 6, yes, thank you. Page 6, line 13. So we've already referenced this some, but we have these standard administrative penalties that apply to all of our enforcement programs unless there's something else specific in statute. So in our standard penalties that you see here, right now, the greatest penalty that we can issue for a single violation is $1,000. The most that we can issue to any specific violator is $25,000. So that would either mean they had 25 different violations or there was an ongoing violation that they didn't correct. So those are the caps that we can issue. In our water quality program, it's $5,000 max. Again, these are just maximums. This doesn't mean what we're going to do. It's a maximum possible penalty. In water quality, it's $5,000 for one violation and $50,000 for all potential violations. I want to emphasize that we don't like to issue maximum penalties. But there are times when we need to do it. Our enforcement philosophy is educate and correct and allow people to comply. Again, it depends on the violation. If somebody's intentionally dumping manure in the river and they keep doing it, then, you know, you have to get people to stop. So you need the ability, I guess the point is that an enforcement program is ineffective if you don't have the authority necessary to change behavior when required. But it's never our preference to start. We don't start with maximum penalties unless someone did something terrible. And really the current $1,000 and $25,000 thresholds, they work almost all the time. We expect to stay within those bounds almost all the time. But we have had some instances, and particularly with some companies in the retail scanning arena. So if you have some big national chains that have retail stores in Vermont, and we are going to them repeatedly, and we are issuing the fines that can only be $1,000 maximum per fine, per violation. And we found that some of those entities are just paying the fine as a cost of doing business instead of fixing the problem. And so that's not useful because the whole idea is we want people to be charged the right price and not to go in and be charged the wrong price. And so that is kind of what prompted this discussion, is that we need to have enough authority to catch people's attention and to stop, ongoing poor behavior. But we also, but in looking at this issue, I mean, the $1,000 maximum fine it goes back to at least 1989. It may even go back longer than that. This particular provision was adopted in 1989. I don't know what preceded it, but $1,000 has been the maximum since then. Not long before 1989, I bought my first car for $750. So $1,000 then was quite a lot different than it is now. It's been 34 years since it's been updated. Inflation obviously makes the current penalty a lot less noteworthy than it was then. So what we're asking for is to make it consistent across our programs. Water quality already has the 5 to 50. Water quality violation is not necessarily more serious than a food safety violation. Intentionally selling adulterated animals or something in a slaughterhouse where you're adulterating animals. So we'd like to make it uniform across our programs, and we'd like to have enough authority when necessary to be able to have a penalty that's sufficient to hopefully change somebody's behavior.
Representative, and then Representative Rice.
So a couple questions. Where does the money go that's collected for fines?
For penalties, it comes to the agency.
Okay, and then can a potential farmer who is being fined by the agency also be fined by other groups for the same offense? Like you mentioned, dumping manure into the creek. Incidentally, I know somebody who did that and they got hit by, I think, the state, by the ANR. Could they also be then dinged by your agency as well?
To the extent that someone is violating multiple provisions of law, potentially.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody could, so in that, yes, I mean, that example could be a point source discharge that ANR would have authority over it. In that case, if ANR was taking authority over it as a point source discharge, we might not.
Okay.
Because we might, but it really is when you dump something intentionally directly into the river, that is a point source discharge where they have authority. We have authority over non-point source discharges. So we do talk to ANR on when things are happening on farms. So in that case, if we knew they were doing it, we might back off. But there are times when someone, say somebody also only had a 10-foot buffer where they were intentionally dumping manure into the river and the requirement is 25 feet. So we might enforce on the 10-foot buffer violation while ANR was taking the intentional discharge into the river. So, we enforce what we do and other people enforce what they do, but we also talk and try to kind of carve out our space where things are disparate.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just wondering if, and acknowledging that this already exists in the water quality section of law, but it goes from 1,000 to 25,000 to 25 times the single maximum for the collective maximum, and to 5 and 50, which is obviously fewer single violations contained within the maximum. I'm just wondering what there's.
So it goes from 1 to 5,000 maximum, or 25 to 50. So you're asking why it's going up 5 times for the one?
Yeah.
I think, most times we're dealing with a violation or two. We're not the 50, the maximum penalty rarely comes into play because we're usually talking about a violation or 2 or 3. The maximum penalty would really only come into play if we told someone to stop and they refuse to and they keep doing it. And so that's when you start getting into that kind of behavior. Fortunately, we don't see that a lot. So to go up 5 times for 25 would put us in the $125,000 range.
Just following your logic that $1,000 now is not what $1,000 in 1989 is. 25 and 50.
Understood. And on that point, in 1989, the maximum total penalty was $10,000.
Okay, so that has increased since then.
It did increase to 25,000. I think that was in the 90s, but I can't remember exactly the year. But yes, it was 1 in 10 back in 1989. And we think, $50,000 is enough to get someone's attention. Most people. So.
So I guess if there could be a potential, like you described, the national chain coming in and cost of doing business, there could be a hypothetical sort of, huge farm that, or there could be a player where $50,000 isn't actually.
That's true. That hasn't been our experience. There are sometimes for water quality, as an example, these are our administrative penalties. If we refer it to the Attorney General's office and they take it, the penalties are much higher by statute. So that's true for water quality. In the retail area that I talked to you about, we've had some cases where we've referred it to the Attorney General's office for violation of the Consumer Protection Act. And there the penalties are also much higher. I think we had one case where maybe it was $1 million before my time for a retailer that wouldn't comply. That money didn't just come to us, but.
John?
Just to follow up on Dave's question, does the Department of Health have violations that also might result in penalties?
Sure, they regulate food safety as well. We're doing it on the farm, slaughterhouses on the farm. I think their focus is more at retail. But they do have FDA has authority over food safety. USDA has authority over food safety. So yeah, there are multiple entities at times. Again, I think when that federal state, if EPA was going to take a direct discharge into a river, then I think ANR would probably back off, but they don't have to. Just like in the criminal arena, you can have a federal and a state prosecution. They're separate sovereigns. They can be handled separately. But generally speaking, I think the different entities that have jurisdiction try to work together to figure out what the best result is.
And generally across agencies, is this policy of educating correct where it starts, or is it pretty distinct to AFM?
I think we have a different approach than a lot of people do. And we get criticized for it. Not everyone agrees with it. A lot of people think we should come in with the sledgehammer. And we agree that the sledgehammer can be appropriate, but it's the whole penalty structure is supposed to be remedial in nature, which means it's not supposed to be punitive. It's supposed to remedy any harm that was actually caused. So oftentimes with the violations that we discover, there hasn't been any significant harm, but it's something that has to be fixed. And, we do expect people to comply with the laws. We do want food to be safe. We don't want pollutants in our water. So, but to say, as an example, that a buffer was 3 feet short, it's kind of hard to say what harm did that cause? Maybe none. But the point is you have to have 25 feet. So CLF would love us to go in and say $5,000, get your buffer at 25 feet. We think, and I think we're right, that we can get more compliance if we're reasonable and if we're educating, and we're trying to bring people on board. When you think about, if you look back 30 years at the law and compare them to now, and you think about the increase in regulations and the additional things that anybody has to do to be able to do anything, it's sort of mind-boggling. And so you can take the approach that if you violate the law, we're coming at you with everything you have, or you can take the approach that we think most people are operating in good faith. We think they want to follow the law. If they don't know it, it's not an excuse. You have to follow the law whether you know it or not. But the better approach is to educate people, get them on board. And we think they're more likely to then follow the law voluntarily than if we come in, make them angry, hit them as hard as we can. And then maybe their approach next time is, well, I'm not going to tell them anything and I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to hide it. And so there's no perfect solution, and some people will not do what is required no matter what you do. And those people, sometimes you have to have the sledgehammer. But most people want to do the right thing. And so when the people want to do the right thing, we want to work with them so that they can. And another thing is, the people we regulate do not tend to be very well off, a lot of them. And these things that we require them to do are expensive. And how are we help if we want them to fix something, but it's really expensive to do, by hitting them with a penalty in addition to that corrective action, and maybe counterproductive. And we are not trying to drive people out of business. We're trying to get them to do their business responsibly. And so, again, we get criticized for it. We're very comfortable with the approach. I personally am very supportive of it. I used to be a prosecutor. If you have a murderer, you take that very seriously. If you have somebody who's jaywalking, you ask them not to do it. So.
Right. So should we move on to water quality?
Yes, please. First one's simple, I think. The second one,
So much.
well, not politically. So the first one, section 7, the water quality. This is, so we have something called the Capital Equipment Assistance Program. And it's designed to improve water quality, to enable us to invest in different capital infrastructure, to allow people to reduce phosphorus from their farms, and also, as it's worded currently, to decrease greenhouse gas emissions. The only thing that we want to do is, because in combating global warming, there's kind of two sides to the equation, right? We need to reduce our emissions. We also need to sequester them. And so the word mitigate is in the Global Warming Solutions Act. That's what the state is required to do. And the word mitigate encapsulates both decreasing emissions and sequestering them. So instead of focusing on only decreasing emissions, we want to be able to focus on activities that decrease emissions and or mitigate them. And often with farming, there's tremendous ways to sequester. There's tremendous ways to sequester carbon in soil, in trees and plants. Decreasing emissions is also really important, but it's not necessarily as cost effective. The ways, and it depends. I mean, obviously the move toward electric, there's a lot of different things that you can do to decrease emissions, but we just want to be able to mitigate in whatever way is the most cost effective. And if things come along that are going to really help global warming, we want to be able to invest in both sides of the equation. So we're just asking, instead of using the sort of antiquated decrease, let's update it to what the state's already required, which is to mitigate, and let's enable the investment in both sides of that equation.
Okay.
And then you eliminated emissions because that is less inclusive, because you're talking about sequestration, drawing down and putting up.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. Thank you. It's more.
That was a question, not a statement.
Oh, sorry. Well, yeah, the gases is more, right. It's all greenhouse gases, which could be methane from animals. It could be emissions. I think it's a little less inclusive. Gases and it's also gases is the word I believe also used in the Global Warming Solutions Act. So it's just harmonizing those words. And also emissions doesn't really naturally include sequestration, arguably. It's not intended to be tricky. It's just trying to be all inclusive. Anything you can do to either decrease greenhouse gases or to sequester them is we want to be on the table.
I'm just a little curious about, and this is the old language, I'm assuming, because it isn't, and reduce costs to farmers. So the implication here is that we don't mitigate or do these other things if it's more expensive to farmers. Is that implied?
I think it's just an acknowledgement that we want to make it cost effective for farmers. We want to incentivize, we want to help them essentially. We're asking farmers to change their practices, and that's what this whole program is based on, is the state giving money, recognizing that these things are in everyone's benefit. They're not in the individual farm's benefit per se. It's in their benefit to the extent that it helps everyone. But we're asking farms to increase their costs for everyone's benefit. And so part of what the state has done as a policy choice is say, we're going to help facilitate those transitions.
Maybe then it would be better to put to reduce costs to farmers rather than at, but I mean, that's a very subtle difference.
Yeah, I mean, that's not a bad point. To me, I think it works either way.
Yeah, sure.
But
I won't stand strong on that.
Circle that and we can talk about it. when we Move to, if we're doing any marking up.
I mean, the only,
Sorry.
no, I'm sorry. Did you want to say something?
Go ahead. Mike has a question, but why don't you finish?
Well, I was just going to say that I think maybe the and is better because some of these programs may not reduce cost to farmers, but we still want them to do it. So as an example, say something costs $500,000 and we're willing to give them 100, but it's going to cost them 400. There's no reducing cost to them,
No.
but it's good for us and they're maybe willing to do it with the incentive. So I actually think the and probably is better.
Right, and it is a reduction, not an elimination of costs.
Right.
Right,
Right.
or associated costs.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Representative Rice.
Just wondering why, if the goal is to include both decreasing emissions and sequestering carbon, why not just name both of those things?
Well, great question, because that's what mitigate does. As mitigate is defined in the Global Warming Solutions Act, it includes decreasing emissions and sequestering them.
But is
So,
this automatically referring to the definition of mitigate within the Global Warming Solutions Act?
well, it's how we're going to interpret it and what we're requesting. We could certainly define mitigate the same way it's defined in the Global Warming Solutions Act, if that would, make you all more comfortable. Or we could reference mitigate as defined in the Global Warming Solutions Act.
Only because, the other things listed certainly have overlap too. Aid in the reduction of surface runoff of agricultural waste to state waters and also improve water quality to state water, those, largely
Yeah.
the same, overlapping goals. So it doesn't seem like it would be out of place to name both decreasing emissions and.
I'm never opposed to being clearer. I mean, we could certainly reference the definition in the Global Warming Solutions Act. We could define it separately in Chapter 215. We're comfortable with it only because it is defined in state statute in a parallel. It's not the same, granted, but it's a parallel program. And we would be the ones implementing it, and that's how we would implement it. And I don't think a challenge to that would be successful. But clarity is always good. As you found in the or and with the.
I want to wrap up by 4.
Okay.
I know the last section is maybe the most interesting section. Want to just give us sort of the quick summary of what's here and
Absolutely.
what was here but isn't here now? And if we need to have you back to go into it in more detail, we can, but.
So I'll do either thing. I would be happy to come back and talk to you about it if you'd like, because it's going to be hard to do in 8 minutes. But I guess maybe I can explain the request and then you could decide if you might like to have us back to talk about it. We think the law is very clear on this, that a municipality cannot charge farmers fees to manage their stormwater. Your attorney, Michael O'Grady, who's got years of experience in this realm, who's very talented, and I've told him this as well, and you should all know that, also agrees that the law is very clear. I have not yet heard a legal argument from anyone that explains what the town's purported authority is to manage stormwater on farms. I'd love to go through the whole framework, but I don't know that we can do that right now. We would like the language that the Senate Agriculture Committee passed to be restored. But I understand the political challenges potentially to that. But we have one request, which is because there are many municipalities that are charging this fee and it's quite expensive. And so what that means is farms are being charged twice. They are being charged from having to comply with the required agricultural practices, which are very expensive. For them to manage their stormwater, farms, anything in a production area, the farmers have to collect it. They have to collect that stormwater and they have to put it in usually in their manure pit, and they have to land apply it. They can't let their stormwater from their production area go anywhere. Even on their fields, they have to comply with required agricultural practices, which means they have to make setback requirements. They have to have buffers. They can only apply certain amounts so that they're not oversaturating their land. So they have very expensive and quite comprehensive regulations about how they have to regulate their stormwater. Because of that, the Agency of Ag administers the RAPs, or required agricultural practices, and we regulate stormwater on farms. Because of that, ANR expressly does not. ANR is the entity delegated by EPA and by the state of Vermont, by the legislature, to regulate stormwater, to regulate discharges through NIFTY's permits, and to regulate stormwater. They're the entity. They are the primary entity to do it. They have no authority over farm stormwater that's complying with the RAPs. They can't do it. So towns, I'm getting too long-winded. I'm trying not to be. It's sort of a fundamental axiom of municipal law that towns only have the authority that the legislature gives them. They're creations of the legislature. They're municipal corporations. It's called Dillon's Rule. Towns don't have more authority than you give them. The only authority the legislature gave them was they can choose to regulate stormwater, but they have to do so. If they're going to do that, they have to assume all of the legal responsibility, and they have to do it consistently with ANR. Well, ANR can't regulate farm stormwater, so it's not consistent for towns to regulate farm stormwater. In addition to that, for the towns to regulate farm stormwater, they have to enact a bylaw, which they've done, to create these stormwater municipal entities, which they have every right to do. No one's saying they can't have stormwater municipal entities. But what they can't do is take more authority than the state has or the state has given them and regulate farm stormwater. And there's another specific provision in Title 24, which governs municipalities. It says municipalities can't enact any bylaw that regulates required agricultural practices. So there are two very clear, in my opinion, provisions in Title 24, which is municipal law, which says to towns, you can't do more than ANR can do, and you can't regulate required agricultural practices. That said, they're doing it. And so what we would like, instead of just putting this into a study, and it's not that there's anything wrong with a study, but it takes time. It delays the outcome. It keeps the uncertainty going, is just say to these towns, and some of them came into the Senate Finance Committee, and I think some of them came into the Senate Ag Committee, come in and just say, what is the legal theory that you have that enables you to regulate farm stormwater when the state can't? Where's your authority? And if they come in with a colorable, solid argument, and Mr. O'Grady has a chance to evaluate it, and it seems like, you know what, there's some ambiguity here, then a study committee might make sense. But right now, there's zero, from my perspective, zero ambiguity. The argument I've heard is everybody should pay their fair share. Well, farms are paying way more than, that's the argument I've heard from towns, is like, we have to regulate stormwater, everybody should contribute their fair share. Farms have to do much more with stormwater than, as far as I know, anyone else, because they can't just let it run off. They have to collect it, and they have to manage it, and they have to apply it appropriately. So, yes.
So just to summarize, the original language that was passed out of the Senate Ag Committee essentially said, this is what we think the law already says, and clarified it. Didn't intend to change anything except practice, the practice of those municipalities. And then that was changed before the bill left the other body to say, no, we're not going to say that. We're going to require a study and see what comes out of it. And then there's several different things listed. So I did say 4:00.
Wait, 2 minutes.
Okay, you can go.
I'm just curious,
Packing
by
up.
striking this and making it clear that, well, it's already clear that they're going outside of their, are we opening them up to lawsuit, these towns?
Well, that's a great question. First of all, they're already subject to lawsuit. And a different tactic would have been to encourage farms to sue them. I personally don't think litigation is very often the best way to solve a problem.
Agreed.
So that's why we came to you and say, let's, because we've told towns you can't do this. And they said, yeah, we can. So farms come to us and complain and say, why am I getting a $3,000 bill when I just had to build a $4,000, structure to contain my stormwater?
So is there a win-win that we can do where we can protect both the farmers by,
Well, so we proposed just clarifying the law so that there's no more ambiguity. So it would be clear and towns wouldn't do it. The Senate Agriculture Committee added sort of an indemnity provision where they said, we're not going to make towns pay the fees that they already collected and shouldn't have, which we think is a fine compromise. I mean, arguably every farmer who's paid should be owed to get their money back, but we understand that creates challenges and towns may not be able to afford it. So to us, that was a compromise that we are comfortable with. But yeah, right now farmers could go and sue, but that's not a great way to solve a problem if you don't have to. So.
You need to come back.
Come back. I'm happy to do it. I'd like to do it because I know the easy thing to do is to just say, study it. And that's okay, but maybe we don't need to study it when it's already clear.
Thanks for this walkthrough and we'll figure out what we're going to do next and